Hi, everyone. Very warm welcome to the Agile Northants event for both our existing members and our new members. We've certainly seen a nice peak in the increase in the number of memberships that we've had due to Dave Snowden's event. And once again, a very warm welcome. So my name's Mohammed, and I have the pleasure in hosting you lovely souls today, together with Imran, who will be doing some co-host duties around breakout rooms and taking questions. This is certainly our 83rd event since the group started back in 2016, and we've been growing on a monthly basis ever since then. Today, we stand at roughly about 2,052 members, and we're really, really proud of that to be able to serve our Agile community out there. So before we get started, just a few opening announcements, if I may. We said last time that we have partnered with the Agile Mastery Institute, which Jeff Watts has initiated. The link will be put into the chat for you all to have a look at after. But certainly one of the key points of our partnership has been the fact that both Agile Northants and the Agile Mastery Institute believe in the continuous improvement of Agile professionals, providing a strong community support and the sharing of knowledge within that community. The context naturally being very key to mastery. And finally, supporting the people that are actually doing the work, every single one of you that are here in this session and all the people that we work with, it's all about trying to support them. So a little bit more about the Agile Mastery Institute. Jeff started this initiative and has been kindly sponsoring our meetup for a couple of months and ongoing. And he's leading the elevation of the Agile certification. We're here to listen to Dave Snowden talk about complexity. But in complex environments, it's not enough to rely on previous knowledge or good practices of others, and it's not possible for expertise to dictate or direct what to do. And this is why the pathways that the Agile Mastery Institute have created go well past the basics of the standard 2-day certifications that we're all found ourselves accustomed to. By combining multiple workshops, months of coaching, plus asynchronous and on-demand support, the Agile Mastery Institute is able to help Agile professionals truly become competent in their space and confident in these highly complex roles that we all play. Jeff has trained up a number of licensed guides all over the world in the pathways of Scrum Masters, product owners, as well as Agile teams, spanning multiple countries and in the cyberspace of virtual learning environments. There are also pathways for Agile coaches and leaderships on the way. You can find out more information in the link that we're going to put in the chat, agilemasteryinstitute.com. If you want to find out more information, feel free to reach out to Jeff or any of his guides, and they'll be happy to take any questions or your queries. In terms of our next event, we have Natalie, who is going to be talking to us about the role of leadership in the future of work. Natalie is dedicated to sustainably shaping the future of work with a human-centered design approach, particularly in a world where technological advancements are evolving at unprecedented pace. Her expertise lies in developing solutions that prioritize the needs and experiences of individuals, whilst also embracing the potential of technology to enhance productivity and efficiency. So again, Imran's going to pop a link on the chat, and you're more than welcome to register for the May event. And finally, before we get on to our main event for today, we'd like to invite you to consider signing up for our Lightning Talks event in June. We have 3 good reasons for you to sign up. Firstly, it helps build your confidence in speaking, which is a really powerful skill to have. You're also welcome to share a topic that you're passionate about and get some feedback in this very safe setting of people who wish to learn and won't judge you in terms of your overall delivery. So if you're interested, there's going to be a link on the chat to be able to sign up. And then once you've submitted your information, we'll be in touch, and we can go from there to secure you for the June event. Having said that, I'd like to welcome Dave Snowden for the event that you've all been here for. And as a brief synopsis, he's going to be talking about bringing complexity back to design and Agile. Now, Agile has become domesticated, and it's time to get back to complex roots. At the Cynefin Company, they believe that as development cycles become more complex, time to market accelerates, Agile process and development needs need to become more adaptive and allow for deeper levels of sense-making and emergence, not less. What we find, however, is that some industry players are striving to standardize and dumb down these same processes with one-size-fits-all frameworks, usually supported by easy certifications. This session picks up on the theme of Rewilding Agile, reflecting on new developments and tools in the Cynefin Company and in the context of a multi-method, multi-tool ecosystem. Having said that, let's learn from Dave today and explore alternative futures and ways of engaging in our work. Dave, the floor is all yours.
Okay. So can you get rid of the slides so I can actually see people? That's better.
100%.
Okay. So when we talked about this, we decided to do it in 2 sessions. So 2 20-minute talks, and then with sort of work groups between in questions. So that will make it easier, I think, to absorb. What I'm going to do in the first section is reflect on the current state of Agile and talk about some of the methods and tools we've had in the space for some time now, like pre-Scrum techniques and complexity-based approaches to design thinking. And then in the second section, I'm going to go on to the really interesting new stuff. Well, I always like new stuff. And please don't spotlight me. I hate being spotlighted. Yeah, a minute.
You prefer not to be?
Yeah, definitely. It's all right. I've gone back to gallery view. So what I'm going to do in the second session is I'm going to look at the new stuff, and there's going to be some really major announcements on this over the next couple of weeks on multi-method, multi-vendor approaches to Agile, as opposed to massive frameworks. And we've had some real breakthroughs in that. And I'm also going to talk about the new work we're doing on distributed decision-making to reduce the bureaucracy within the process, and also the really radical new stuff, the third framework we can have in, which is STRI mapping, which is a whole new way of looking at what's possible within the present state. So kind of like what I'm going to do in the first section is reasonably well established. In the second session, that's kind of like the new areas that we develop. And just to give you 2 key pieces of background here, well, 3 really, right? One is I tend not to take hostages. So I sort of call things like they are, and I'm not prepared to be nice about things I think are stupid just because it will upset people, I'm afraid. Second thing is that for those who don't know, I was actually one of the 3 founders of the DSDM consortium, which actually fed into the Agile Manifesto. So there were 3 feeds into Agile: XP, Scrum, and DSDM. DSDM was significant because it was set up, I was then strategy director at Data Sciences, and it was set up between myself, my equivalent at Logica, and Data Sciences and Logica were deadly competitors in those days, and also Ed Holt, who kind of like drove a lot of the process. And one of the important things about that is we set up a standard between competitors rather than creating a proprietary approach based on a single company. We also set it up over dinner in a pub in Cheltenham. We didn't need the ski resort for a week, but that's kind of like another story on another day, all right? But I want to come back to that in a minute or two, because that was actually quite important. We said you can't afford to have proprietary control of a framework if you really want to get mass adoption. Yeah? And if you want to know which, there was a pub in Cheltenham, it's the one in the hollow on the road that goes from Cheltenham going back to Cirencester at the bottom, which is a really nice pub. Yeah. And yeah, so that was kind of like where we set the whole thing up and decided to do it. Now the non-proprietary aspect I want to build on in a second, all right? But just hold that. Before that, I'd be designing decision support systems for the like of Guinness PLC at board level and elsewhere. So my background is decision support and very heavily focused on interface with C-level executives. So how does IT support C-level executives in decision making? Not just in terms of financial stuff, but in terms of logistics and elsewhere. So that's my IT background in that sense. But by the time we set up DSDM, I was in strategy. Then IBM bought us and put me into a pure research role. And that was where we started to get into complexity and narrative work. So that's kind of like one strand on this. Yeah. The other thing I want to say is that I think we all need to get a bit real about the fact that Agile is currently heavily into its commoditization phase. Now, for anybody who knows about market lifecycle theory and corporate strategy, commoditization is when you know something is coming to the end of its life cycle. And interestingly, that's where you can introduce something new. That's kind of like the second framework within Cynefin called Fletcher's curves. So when something becomes highly commoditized, generally the dominant supplier, what we call the apex predator, is actually fairly immune from price pressure, but everybody else is suffering it. And therefore they don't see the collapse come in till it's too late. You see this with IBM, with its focus on hardware, getting displaced by Microsoft with a focus on software, getting displaced with Apple with a focus on ecosystem. Commoditization actually makes the apex very, very vulnerable. Yeah, and you can see this in the way that's working. So that's where I'm going to go to in the second session. And by the way, that principle applies if you're trying to get adoption of a novel approach in your company. If your company has just taken on board a new entire approach to cultural change, you have to wait for it to become commodified before you've got a chance to introduce something new. Timing is kind of like everything in this particular space. And the apex predator, to be honest, whether it's Scrum or SAFe is an open question, but SAFe are the one who've driven commoditization big time. I wrote the first time I came across SAFe, which was at Novi Sad in former Eastern Europe, and I still remember looking at the presentation and writing a ferociously angry blog post, which was entitled "The Infantilization of Management," which took me about 10 minutes to write, but is still current and got massively attacked by SAFe proponents. Yeah. So I'll say up front there, for me, SAFe is everything that Agile shouldn't be. And people who argue it's actually a good Trojan horse should remember that, kind of like from the point of view of the Trojans, that was involved massacre, blood, torture, deception, and all sorts of other things. Yeah. But I'll talk a bit more about that in the aftermath. So if you let's go back to Snowbird and the launch. You have three things which come in: XP, XP, Scrum, and DSDM. DSDM had one representative. It was fairly minor in that play. The two big guys were the XP community. Had actually driven, if you look at the history of the build up to Snowbird, that was mostly XP. And then Scrum and others came along. Now, I remember speaking at Agile Scotland and saying that XP was probably closer to the heart of Agile. And that was before Agile's, Alistair started to use that word, so I'm using it more generally. At which point the whole XP community cheered me, and I thought, well, I better try and do something about that. And I said, the trouble is you guys can't talk to anybody who isn't another XP person, which is why nobody adopted it. And everybody picked up on Scrum. And the reason for that is going back to Max Boisser, who is my mentor. If you haven't read Max's book, Knowledge Assets, that's highly recommended. And what Max talks about is the level of abstraction and codification that you need for something to diffuse quickly. So something is highly abstract and highly codified. Take a map. You have semiotics, you have symbols on the map, you can learn what those mean, you can use it quite quickly. So it's highly abstract, highly codified. It can be used by lots of people. Contrast that with a London taxi driver. And if you know how London taxi drivers are trained, they drive around the streets of London for 2.5 years. That's kind of like the minimum in their own time at their own cost until they know the name of every street. And the exam is to be given 2 points in London and to be asked to describe the route out and the route back, turn by turn, mentioning every major landmark en route. It has a 40% pass rate over multiple attempts. And it's quite fun to ask a London cabbie, how long did it take them to do it? And they'll all say, well, everybody else takes 2 or 3 years. I did it in 18 months, which means they're lying bastards. because fundamentally the hippocampus has to physically change its structure in order to accommodate that knowledge. This is one of the first cases where we actually found a lot of human knowledge isn't cognitive. It actually requires physical change. So if you want to take this as a metaphor, XP was the London cabbie, whereas Scrum was the math. All right, so XP took years for the people to acquire the skills. It was highly, it had a very high failure rate. But the trouble is it couldn't be adopted quickly, whereas Scrum could be. So basically Agile became Scrum, if you go back to the starting point. Although why anybody associates something which moves quickly with a Scrum as a former rugby player is kind of like a rather odd association, but never mind, right? And the trouble is that Scrum went down the open source method, but certify and control content type route, which was very successful. That was with Ken, and then it moved on to other versions. And that was then the model that everybody else picked up and copied. Yeah, and that was when Agile became about certifications, certificates, attending 2-day courses, rereading slide sets, and so on. And all the things which have been criticized many times by many people, but people still do. And then if you go back to SAFe, it was sold off three things. First of all, is a desire of executives to say they've been Agile, but actually do something fairly conventional. It fed that one quite well. Secondly, the desire of senior executives to spend millions of dollars on something which will take 3 years to deliver. Sorry, I've been C-level a lot of my life. Nothing is better than a big project which is not going to deliver everything for 3 years, but you can say how wonderful it's going to be and move on to your next job and repeat the process. And you can see that extensively. And then the third thing, and this is to the shame of many people in the Agile movement, it was sold off a Ponzi scheme. If you did the 4-day course, you were then allowed to do the 3-day course, provided you paid a royalty without any experience other than actually following through the scheme. And that allowed it to spread very quickly, and that appealed to people in the Agile community. So 10 out of 10 for marketing, 2 out of 10 for ethics, and a few other things on that ground. So that's kind of like the background. The other big problem, I think, on the whole thing is the adoption of a manufacturing metaphor. Now, there's an irony here because Agile says it was adopting complexity science, but actually it's straight down the road systems thinking if you look at it in terms of what it does. And the manufacturing metaphor is fundamental. It basically says that, I need to be told what I need to do, and I need to process this in as efficient a way as possible. And to be slightly cynical on this, Agile people really don't like users very much. They find them extremely inconvenient. So they really want them to appoint one representative to say what they want at the start of the process and then go away while we deliver something else downstream. I'm being slightly cynical there, but user engagement is actually quite low in terms of the way it works. Now, one of the things that we focused on was effectively what we call pre-Scrum techniques. So I'm going to talk about those to give the illustration. Because a lot of the problems with Agile is, and I'll say this from years of experience in IT, users never know what they want, until you give them what they've asked for, and then they discover they wanted something else instead. This is almost a universal. And the reason for that is users don't know what technology can do. So they ask for what they think it might be able to do, or what they've heard from a friend. The reality is technology can deliver things that they haven't even imagined yet. So this manufacturing process, with quick cutoff lines is just not going to work. So we looked at 3 separate things on this, and these are the ones I'll run through. One was to increase the range of activity at the user requirement definition, and to be honest, to get rid of systems analysts. Now, one of the reasons we wanted to get rid of them, that they have a role, but the user requirements, I'm dubious about it. One of the reasons is the famous case is if you give radiologists a batch of x-rays, ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. Yeah. And this, this is quite scary. It's called inattentional blindness. And the trouble is, systems analysts can already have an expectation about what they're going to see, so what's they hear. Linked to that, by the way, if you conduct more than 2 or 3 interviews, you form a subconscious hypothesis, and you physically only pay attention to things that support that hypothesis thereafter. Yeah, this is basic science, by the way. This isn't a sort of theory about it. This is actually basic science. So if we know that, then the idea you can go and interview people, you can run a workshop, you can send out an analyst, and really get to what people need is fundamentally flawed. So we take a couple of different approaches to this. One is, and this is a method called entangled trios. I'll come back to the latest version of this in the second session. So what we do is we put together 3 people. One is a bright young coder, somebody who can code really quickly and knows the latest technology. Super bright, super intelligent, probably unable to talk with anybody other than his or her mother. Yeah, but you know the type. Yeah. Secondly, you have a systems architect or a systems tester. Interestingly, people who test whole systems tend to have a really good awareness of the wider ecosystem. So you're looking for, this is called a transgenerational pair, by the way. You're looking young, bright without too many exceptions, and old, bright with lots of experience. Yeah, that actually works. Young employees with older employees, we put those together. And then we put them with a third person, a user trained to talk to IT people. And we're going public on this later this year. We actually do a fair amount of it. It's much easier to train a user to talk to IT people than train IT people to understand users. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. So what we do is we put people together in 3s and we throw 20 or 30 trios at the problem for 4 or 5 weeks and see what they come up with. That means some of them will see a gorilla, coming back to the principle. And again, this is using science as a constraint. We know that if you have a small group of people, they won't see it. Yeah, an analyst will never see it. So we create those diversity within the system. Right? That's really easy to do. It gets lots of people engaged. And it has the other huge side benefit. It increases the interaction, the informal networks between the IT department and the user community, which is also key. If you read the European Union Field Guide on Managing Complexity, which I was the principal author on, you'll see it actually argues very strongly for informal networks as the way to link silos. Yeah? Now, what I'm doing is I'm just throwing this stuff around and saying, look, once you get the science right, then you can start to develop methods. And our whole approach is to spend 2 or 3 years working with the science, work the methods out from that, then 3 or 4 years experimenting to get it right. What we don't do is take the last 3 projects I worked on and create a method or framework from that, which has been the general characteristic of the Agile community. Yeah, there needs to be more discipline in that. Second example of this, and this is actually on delivery, you may or may not remember one of the big things in DSDM was time boxes. Time boxes are really useful in the modern form we use. You have a minimal viable product, a maximum deliverable product, and a minimal commitment of resource and a maximum commitment of resource, and a fixed delivery date. If you work in a large multi-project environment or you're an executive, what you need to know is when you're going to get something. You don't want somebody saying, we'll delay you until you get better quality. Now, there was a really nice cartoon satire on this in Facebook today about an Agile team saying, well, we delivered your birthday cake 3 weeks later, but we wanted to make sure it tasted better. Yeah. So DSDM focused on that. The other interesting thing is self-organizing teams. If you give them ranges of deliveries and ranges of resources, but a fixed time delivery will nearly always achieve it. And it creates a stimulation for them to work together in ways that they wouldn't otherwise do. And we'd always put users into those teams. It also allows for variety. So we use this a lot when I was running data sciences. And we were using this effectively to specify entire projects. And also, to be honest, to do the full costing. In estimating is much better in multiple small teams with diversity working on different macro aspects of the project, some of them working in parallel, then pulling the stuff together. I don't want to get torn into the no estimates against everything has to be estimate dispute, because kind of like it's guys, all right, you're both right, but just listen to each other. It depends on context is my view on that one. Yeah. So we were doing it for that, and we just went under huge pressure on some big defense contracts. So I started to run JAD sessions, and this was joint application design, yeah, which was the way, sorry, forget, I need to jump between the two. I've been working all day. So basically, time boxes are a very effective way. And one of the things we can do, for example, and I'll mention this in the second session, is replace sprint in Scrum with a 3-month time box. Start to think about that, because I'm going to come back to that later. This is kind of like the mixed methods approach. Yeah. The other big thing that we did was joint application design. This originally came from IBM in Canada. We really built it up and magnified it. And in a joint application design session, you get users and IT people together for 1 or 2 days. Really intensive interaction, takes a lot of facilitation, and you build prototypes. Building prototypes is far more effective than writing specifications. Yeah, and we actually ended up with specialist prototypers. Just to tell you something funny here, we found the best prototypers were the worst possible people to have on a software delivery team, because they got bored very quickly. Yeah, and we actually therefore found a use for bright but easily bored, right, on that group. So we started to do them on 3 time zones. So we'd have a team in Farnborough, which would work, and then we'd hand it over to a team in Mumbai to work on the prototype, and they would hand it over to a team in San Francisco to complete the prototype, and it would come back to us the next morning. This is called 888 for the 3 8-hour time differences. Yeah, so kind of like users and IT people get something together, pass on the requirement, pass on the prototype, and then that gets iterated twice. And then one day I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning and realized I'd sent on the prototype, but forgot to send on the user requirement. And you probably all had these moments where you think, oh shit, it's too late. I've messed up. What the hell am I going to do in the morning? I'm quite good at improvisation because I do this frequently. And if you're good at it, you get to do it for a long time. Went in the next morning to discover all the users around the screen saying, oh my God, I would never have thought of that. Could we have it? And what had actually happened is the Mumbai team had been fairly compliant. Oh, they haven't sent the user requirements. So they made assumptions about what the users had asked for and added features in. Then it went to San Francisco and they got stroppy and said, we were meant to have the requirement, but we haven't. So we were lucky we did this way around. So Mumbai said, well, we did it, so you should be able to, which kind of like had the right effect. And then from that, we instituted it, because what we were doing was introducing deliberate mutation into the system. Yeah? And if you introduce mutation into the system, you get much faster evolution. Yeah? And the third technique we've been working on is unarticulated need management, yeah, where what we're doing is using a Gemba system, if you know the Japanese concept of Gemba, to actually journalize continuously user experiences, frustrations, etc., and then to mathematically group those together in clusters of user anecdotes, which we feed into programming teams to build a prototype to test assumptions. Yeah? So again, if you can see with all 3 of those methods in different ways, they're looking to diversify the input hugely before it feeds into a traditional agile process. And my argument on this, which I've made on several forums, is the failure on agile deliveries is generally actually like it always has been in IT, there's no change, is that when users get the system that they specified, and you can often prove that they specified it, then they realize what they could have asked for. Yeah. So the more you can create rapid iteration around that upfront. Okay. So with that, that's my first 20 minutes down. I wanted to talk about some of the work we did around Agile, some of the additional methods we brought in. The 3 I've talked about are entangled trios, 888, and unarticulated user need mapping. And by the way, those are all in the Cynefin.io, they're open source methods. Yeah. So they're all there if you want to look at it. Okay, so happy to create a break, yeah, and go from there. Okay, so you're going to put them in groups?
Yeah, Imran will sort that out. Imran, thank you. In the meantime, Dave, maybe just to give some guidance to those going off to the breakout rooms. Is there anything specific you wish them to?
The idea of this is to give people a chance to have a discussion in smaller groups, and then come back into questions in the bigger group. Yeah, because that gives everybody a chance to have a think and talk. So it's kind of like quick and dirty, small groups, have a chat, what do you want to ask, come back into the bigger group, and we'll deal with questions on that. And then I'll move on to the second 20 minutes and talk about the new stuff.
Great, sounds
great.
Good.
How much time you're talking about?
We're talking about 15 minutes for questions overall, so you're probably about 5-7 minutes in groups and 5-7 minutes back in plenary.
Great, thank you. I'm sending all in the breakout rooms.
So while Imran does that, if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask now before you go off.
Kind of expecting I've probably been left stuck without a room, and you probably don't want me here. That.
So for those of you that are still with us here, you've probably either chosen not to join the breakout room, which is cool. Or if you haven't had the prompt, please let us know and we'll assign you to a room.
Mohammed, can you check? One of the persons in the chat has mentioned, I can't see him in unassigned.
Yeah, Tuan says they got kicked out for some reason. Shall we? I'll reassign you, Tuan. I hope I've said your name right.
Yes, thanks. Just waiting. Thank you.
Oh. Yeah, I have assigned her.
Thank you.
No, it's definitely not working. It just sends me to like this empty screen, and then it says, and there's nothing there.
That's weird. Can you try from your side, Mohammed?
Sure. Let me try and find. Okay, try that now, Tuan. I've assigned you to room number 10.
You're not getting rid of some people.
I'm back.
You're back. Did you actually make it into room 10?
No, because basically I clicked on it and then it just sent me to this Zoom page where it says find a team chat, find meetings, and it's this weird admin hell.
Very strange. Sorry for that. That's not the experience we would have expected you to have had.
Oh, don't worry, it's fine.
You can
So
also
hopefully
you can
in the
pick a
second
room at the
breakout room.
bottom and join it. Yeah.
Say again, Dave?
You can always pick a room from the bottom. Yeah, there's thing pick a room and you can join from there. So you haven't joined room 10 at the moment, Joanne. That's what it says on my screen.
Yeah, indeed.
If you click breakout rooms below and scroll down and do join.
Hopefully the second breakout room we do today will not have the same experience for you. But
Just
Imran's
click
going to
all
be
the
calling
rooms,
him
so
back
it's sure
shortly.
it's,
Sorry, Rohit.
I was saying that you're going to call them back shortly anyway, so
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. It still don't work. It's just some weird bug, but that's fine. I can hang out with you guys.
absolutely.
This is a better breakout room, right?
Yeah, I mean, feel free to share any comments or thoughts here if there is anything. Anybody who wants to chime in, you're welcome to do so.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was just going to say that, I mean, I kind of, I guess you could say I'm slightly new to Agile. I mean, I'm a PM for an agency, a global agency, but I've done the certifications. But I thought, yeah, Dave Snowden, this is, I guess, my first introduction to you. And I really liked your talk. I thought you were incredibly razor sharp and on it. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I'm really keen to do some research after this and find out more about your work. And because clearly you are some kind of treasure trove of knowledge and wisdom.
some people call it cynicism and curmudgeonliness. All right.
No, I'll take that as well. It's, see it for what it is, yeah, I really like that.
Cynics are the ones in the organization who care about it.
Yeah.
Should I close the breakout rooms now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
I
so.
think we
Bring them
can
back.
have a
Let's see
time.
what.
Okay, people should start flooding in the next 20 seconds. You guys all had some good, interesting conversations. We're looking forward to hearing them. Yeah, I think we're good. So Dave, you can carry on with your next part.
Okay, I think it's more, this is a chance for anybody to raise anything now or ask a question. We'll just give you 5 minutes for that, then move on. So anything anybody wants to raise?
I would like to ask, if possible, if it's okay, how you were talking about the trios, and as much as the idea is fantastic that you have a highly skilled coder that's new and a highly skilled architect that's a bit older and has a lot of knowledge, and a user, I wonder how does that scale to a wider company and big company when not everybody is highly skilled.
Don't necessarily need to be highly skilled. I mean, we use the same technique. For example, we put people in their first 6 months are required to keep daily journals of their learning, and they're put in pairs with people within 2 or 3 years of retirement. And then the third person is somebody on the fast track management development program. And the reason for this, by the way, is linked with plasticity. So the brain is fairly plastic and open to novelty up until early 20s female, late 20s male. And then it opens up again late 50s, late 40s. And the hunter-gatherer context of that is key. You know, at a certain age, you have to adopt the prejudice of the tribe. If you survive to late 40s, 50s, you've got something about you, but you can't lead the tribe, so you go into the wisdom business. So this is something I'll call the grandparent syndrome. Grandparents tell things to grandchildren and vice versa. And very young people aren't any threat to older people. Right? So basically, generally taking young, and they don't have to be brilliant, they just have to be competent and wider, more experienced, and then that user trained to talk to IT people, which is actually quite fast. I mean, I may actually put it up in the open source wiki as 5 simple heuristics that you have to follow. Yeah, like, don't introduce new material into the old material is absorbed. Yeah, and you do not argue with somebody who's a coder, go on to another subject and wait till they calm down and come back to it again. So there are various guidance you can give on that. Yeah. Sorry, Neil, you got your hand up. I'm going top screen and going across.
Yeah, thanks. So if you interview people in the first 2 or 3 interviews, you'll have formed a hypothesis and you'll only be listening out for that in future. Does that mean you'd suggest that like user research as a discipline are barking up the wrong tree? They do a lot of structure the interviews, and
I quite enjoy it. If I have a client friend and you get the big consultancies come in, I ask them how they deal with the problem and show them the science. And of course they don't, because they've already got an assumption. Your danger is that you come in with the assumptions, all right, about what you expect to see. You literally, this is the gorilla. You do not see what you do not expect to see. All right. So given that that's the case, you have to diversify. It's why we developed SenseMaker, for example, which was the first ever field ethnography system, which is allowing people to be ethnographers to their own condition rather than having third parties come in. So once you get it, you can do things at scale. Yeah. So highly structured things, some aspects of risk systems, some ordered aspects of the system, it's not a problem because you are only going to find what you expect to find. But if you really want added value, you can't risk that. Yeah. Ben?
Yeah, so we, in the breakout, we were talking about, I guess, our experience in our workplaces that are quite different from the techniques and methods that you're describing. When there's a situation where the practice is very kind of deviated, I guess, from what you're talking about here, how do you prioritize where to start? I'm assuming the answer isn't just pin the tail on the donkey and pick something.
I like being called deviant. It sounds like an interesting position to be in. Basically, if you look at the history of IT, and remember, IT is a very young discipline and it hasn't yet become a profession. Yeah, I mean, there's very little sign at the moment that it is trying to become a profession as well, by the way. But it's, I was there at the start. I learned how to code on punch card machines, which taught you real discipline. Compile error card 3, you learn to think about it before you code it, right? So we're still within the first or second or third generations of the field, and it takes time for it to stabilize, right? So that would be one comment. The other comment is that the failure rates on IT projects and the overruns on IT projects are really very high. Right? So just carrying on doing the same thing is kind of like contraindicated. And there's a lot of evidence that the fundamental problem is the upfront specification. And I'll give you another distinction. We used to distinguish, when I was running a business, between sales consultants and ordinary consultants. And ordinary consultants would listen to what the client wanted and would try and deliver it. Sales consultants would talk to the client to the point where the client wanted something that we could deliver more easily. Right? Now, in modern environments, that's called co-evolution. Yeah, and I would argue often it's a Pareto principle, it's an 80-20 rule. Yeah, and that's a different type of skill. So we're trying to distribute that in a sense. So this is a consistent area of failure. What we've introduced is 3 very simple techniques. Pick them up and try them, see if they improve things or not. It's kind of like the basic argument. And I would say this generally, I'm going to come on to this next session. We've got to stop these mass changes. Like everything we've done in the past is appalling. Let's throw it out and adopt a new framework. I would ban the whole concept of transformation, whether it's agile or organizational change. Yeah. It's much more about incremental evolution, respecting. To put it another way, we want a renaissance, not an enlightenment. Yeah, we need to recognize there's good stuff in the past and there's new stuff, and we need to put the two together. We don't want to be always throwing out everything and starting again. Yeah. Mark.
Hi, Dave. I was wondering, if you take a regular Scrum team, in what way or what new skills would the Scrum Master have to acquire to implement these things? What would you advise?
I mean, to be quite honest, I think you could do most of these just by reading the method on the wiki and trying them out. I mean, we'll train people and we'll mentor people, but it's not particularly difficult, right? If you want a more broader case on that, I think the Scrum Master needs to start to change the dynamics of the interaction of their team with users. So, for example, we're now deploying the Gemba system to replace retrospectives. Right? So it's much better to gather continuous data as it happens and experience with users as it happens, which also, by the way, gives us a mathematical measure of the impact of Agile on the user community, which is quite important. So I think that changing the interactions is probably the key. And I'll make this a general point, by the way. In complexity theory, you focus not on people, you focus on how people interact. We ban the mindset word, for example, because A, it's really bad science. There is no such thing as a mindset, and there are no such thing as mental models. Yeah, that's a rather odd 19th century concept that people are continuing. Yeah, a lot of decision making is done in social interaction, not within the brain. And your body makes about 70-80% of your decisions for you. Yeah, and I could go on that. Okay, I better go on to the next thing, otherwise we'll run out of time.
Maybe can I add one thing, because what you just said is that the Gemba system, but in a regular Scrum team, wouldn't that then go that you have to also change the role of the product owner completely? So you have like
you've noticed
2 of those roles changing.
Yeah. But basically what we're doing is we're distributing the product owner. So basically, rather than the product owner filtering requirements, yeah, you actually distribute the requirements capture over a much broader context, and you get people to work collectively, not individually. Right? Now, it's changing a role. I'm going to come on to this next, all right? Moving from a person to a combination of roles is actually not a major change. The method stays the same. It's just what's doing the actor. Now, so let me talk about that now, because that's where I was going to go on to. One of the things we're now working on is distributed decision making. So what we're trying to do is to allow decision making to be made at the front end in a way which is auditable and controllable, but which doesn't involve bureaucracy. We're having a lot of talks with the NHS at the moment on this, because if you look at clinical decisions, the clinicians know what to do, but in order to get approval to do it, they have to go through 4 or 5 levels of management and write business plans. Yeah? I've currently got a dislocated finger because I forgot the golden rule about taking the straps off your trekking poles when you may fall, and it's been 9 months and I may get it straight again. But my meetings with my physiotherapist are now half an hour, not 15 minutes, because I'm helping her write her business plans, because I know how to do that and she doesn't. Yeah. And we all know what's going to be decided anyway, and we reckon there's about 40% wasted cost there. Yeah. So that's one component. The other component is people in roles will confess to failure, whereas individuals won't. This is Viken Sutcliffe's work on mission critical organizations, because it's the role confessing failure, not the individual. And if you look at it, all military units use crews, they don't have teams. In a crew, people are trained in role and role expectation, and a crew is an interaction of roles, which gives you very fast substitution. Yeah? You can assemble an operating team is a good example, an operating theatre. You've got the surgeon, you've got 8 or 9 different roles, and when people go through the scrubbing up process, which isn't just about hygiene, it's a ritual, it switches their identity from who they were before they went in to the role they're going to occupy. Right? We did some experimental work on this, which anybody is prepared to replicate. Coders who changed their clothes actually spotted more software errors when testing than coders who didn't. And it goes back to that who sees the gorilla, because basically you're observing 5% of available data. That's triggering a whole series of memories. Yeah. You blend those memories together, and they're physical and social memories as well as cognitive, and you do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. That's how we all make decisions. So basically what you pay attention to and what memories you use are key, and what ritual does is it organizes the memories linked to the role. So a crew has cognitive capacity which is higher than the individuals. Yeah? So, for example, what we're now doing is saying that if a senior nurse, a nurse with 10 years experience gets agreement from a consultant surgeon in the same area in a different part of the hospital who she doesn't know, together with an anonymous avatar from finance, so nobody knows who's occupying that role, they can spend up to $10,000 without further audit approval. Yeah, in some cases, we're now actually putting those up, so an executive can choose to cancel something, but they never ask permission to do something. It says these are the things the trios are going to do. Which do you want to cancel? Which is different psychology. Yeah? Now, again, come back to we talked about on trios about making decisions. The more decisions you can make in a distributed network, the faster you make decisions, the more agile you are, and the less bureaucracy you've got. But just saying, let us do what we want to do isn't going to work. Yeah, because actually distribution of decision making is very different from delegation of decision making. Yeah. Now that's getting a lot of traction at the moment. It's a development of entangled trios, but it's a way of giving responsibility to people working in different combinations, but it's roles in combination, it's not the individual. And by the way, we just recently introduced that anonymous avatar because that keeps people honest. We're looking at this in a development sector at the moment to allocate development grants, because the cost of, everybody knows in development, if you give somebody $5,000, it probably produces $50,000 of benefit. If you give somebody $5 million, it might produce 10 million. Smaller sums produce bigger benefit. But the administrative costs of smaller sums is so impossible that people don't do it. So what we're now doing is seeing this as a whole new way of doing budgeting. And actually there's going to be some conversations going on with the beyond budgeting people about this at the moment. But the key thing is to switch into roles, not people. Right? Now that should be natural for Agile, because Agile has got a lot of predefined roles, but you can see how that works. Yeah. So that's one of the things we're working on. The other one is S-Drime mapping. This is the third framework in Cynefin. It normally takes, just to give you an idea, it takes me about 7 or 8 years to produce an idea ready to go to market, ready to be tested in practice, because we have to get the theory right. Then about 4 to 5 years to get the practice right against the theory. We start with theory and then create practice. We don't start with practice from which we derive theory. Yeah, and that's really important in the conditions of uncertainty. Yeah, and if I go back to SAFE, SAFE is entirely based on Dean's half-remembered context of 3 projects he ran. And to me, that's not a foundation for anything. Yeah, so we start with natural science. Yeah. This has taken about the same amount of gestation. The origins are in constructor theory and quantum mechanics, constraint theory and complexity and a few other things. But what took Cynefin 5 or 6 years has taken this 4 or 5 months. It's really taken off. Yeah. So what we do is we start by mapping all of the constraints which are in play. And by the way, constraints is not the same thing as theory of constraints. Yeah, constraints can be positive as well as negative. Yeah. And what we do, having done that, and I'm just going to give you an indication of this because this is the latest thing, is from that we create this, which is called an S-Drime map. Yeah. And hopefully you can only see that. So each of those hexagons represents what's called a constraint or a constructor. So a constructor is something, when something encounters it, it goes through some sort of transformation. A constraint connects or contains. So we put them on a grid between energy cost of change and time to change. And anything top right of that counterfactual line realistically isn't going to change. It's not a space in which we can operate. The liminal line is the group we're working with can't change it, but somebody else in the organization might be able to. We had a real breakthrough on this in one of the farmers, by the way, in that they put stuff in that. I brought in the CEO, he took one look at it and said, you can change any of those. Why didn't you ask? Yeah, so that's making that visible. Bottom left is highly volatile, but the middle space is where we can actually make a difference. And what we then do is we pick those clusters and we say, what can we do with those clusters to either move them north, south, east, or west? To increase the energy cost or reduce the energy cost of change or increase or reduce the time. And what that ends up with is the organization effectively runs with about maybe 20 or 30 micro projects, yeah, rather than a macro one. Yeah. I'm trying to stop this. Hang on, I need to escape from that. So this is being published on the blog. There's case studies of people in the Agile community who picked it up. What you end up with is 40 or 50 micro projects without any politics or dissent, rather than a macro project. It also works off a complexity principle of working out what I can change in the here and now, rather than an idealistic statement of where I would like to be in the future. And that's actually a really important distinction. Virtually everybody in the last 30 or 40 years has started off by designing an ideal future state and trying to close the gap. Here we define what we can change in the present, or which other people could change, and we effectively start journeys from the present with a sense of direction. This, for those of you who want to know, is called the Frozen 2 strategy. And I'm assuming that everybody has seen Frozen 2, and if not, go and watch it because it's a great complexity movie. And in the middle of Frozen 2, the real heroine of the Frozen series, who's the younger sister without the magic, sings a beautiful song, all I can do is do the next right thing. Okay? In complexity theory, that's called the adjacent possible. In evolution, you can't go from, you can't just jump across to an ideal future state. You have to go through stages in evolution. Yeah. Now, we're now starting to play with this for personal development. The whole day session on this on Monday has got the coaching market really excited, along with the Gemba system. But we're also looking at it as defining the user, defining the IT space. Yeah, i.e. defining lots of small things that you can do in the here and now or small projects, which will change the dispositional space. So it's more, the energy gradient of goodness is lower than the energy cost of badness. Yeah? Now, again, I'll make a comment on this. I've gone back to my object-oriented textbooks from the 80s. We're really seeing applications, emergent properties of objects within scaffolding or architecture. But also I was arguing in Corba committees back in the 80s that people are objects too. So come back to my entangled trios, combinations of roles, that's an object. It's polymorphic, it's got input-output, it's got inheritance. And if we start to think about organizations in that way, then software starts to change into something quite radically different. Yeah, so we're using this for strategy, for personal development, wider. And as I say, it's taken off faster than Cynefin did. The other thing that we're doing is, and we've now got, this is the actively under the way with both of the major Scrum organizations, yeah, with one of them through Essence, who we've got a partnership with Kanban, with Business Agility, with the DevOps community, with several. And what we're doing is we're breaking down every method or framework into its lowest coherent unit and producing physical facilitation kits, which you can use with those so that you can literally put together something as big as SAFe, but from multiple elements of all the other people's methods with QR codes linking back to the site so you can get training direct from the originators. Yeah. Now, just to give you an insight into this, yeah, I'm going to have to do this twice. Yeah. So this is actually the, as you can see here, are the ones coming out of Essence where we combine at practice level. So you can see sprint, retrospective, sprint. You can then see us putting our methods into that, like 888 and entangled trios. Yeah. So in a facilitation environment, this allows you to put different things together in different contexts and have radically different conversations about what you're actually doing in that space. I've got to stop sharing this. We'll get there in the end. I'm trying to stop sharing. It's not giving me the option on the screen. Stop sharing. Right. I could go on and give you more examples of that, but as I say, we've got complete commitment from both the major Scrum organizations on this. And I say the idea is that actually you can also introduce new methods and tools and techniques. The roles are defined, we've got principles defined and so on. So this will come out in probably an announcement in 3 or 4 weeks' time. We've already done all the experiments around the EU field guide with this. But the principle is, instead of choosing a single framework or a single approach, you actually put together things from different frameworks and different vendors in different combinations, and you can change that over time. And we've committed to make that open source. So our methods are branded Cynefin Company, but the overall thing has an independent brand and will be independently managed, because we don't want to own that. Yeah. So there's 3 or 4 attempts at the moment to create alternatives to SAFe, where people are branding their own method, even if they're borrowing from other people. The idea here is the originators of the methods and tool sets provide kits. So you always go back to the originator of the method, not somebody copying it or finding a new application. We've got Spotify coming in there as well as in others. So that was a sort of insight into 3 areas where we're currently working. Yeah, and how they impact on Agile. Those are at a much earlier stage of development than the other ones, but that was to give you an idea of where we see the future. Okay, so we'll break into groups for 7 minutes, then it's open forum after that. see if it
So
works.
just whilst we do that, Dave, there's been some additional questions on the chat. If I can take
Yeah.
those now, and then we can take a fresh set of
Okay.
questions after the team comes back. So we have one question that says, what would you consider the apex predator in the world of Agile? Scrum Alliance?
No, I think it's probably safe.
Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, what Safe have done, if you look at it, they just took the whole of the Scrum method and dumped it into Safe and just rebadged it. And if you haven't seen it, and I think Dean actually sold, I think 51% of it for a large sum of money. And you're now getting a commercial company which is actually trying to squeeze out people on IP issues. There's been that on social media and elsewhere. Yeah. So I think that's the case, right? And that's probably why we got cooperation from everybody on this. And by the way, it isn't Essence. Essence goes down a level. This matches in with Essence at practice level. And therefore we got that interface agreed with Essence. But Hexi is different. Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. The next question is, what software was created using the entangled trios method?
Oh, God, don't ask. Well, we do all our work on that and we manage our company on it and it's been used. You'd have to go and ask, all right?
Okay, thank you. Next question. Are there specific rituals that separate out entangled trios from Three Amigos?
Yeah,
And the
because
same question for
Three
the
Amigos,
unarticulated.
Three Amigos just focuses on three people with different backgrounds. It doesn't deal with roles. Yeah, and it doesn't train people in role and role expectation. There's a really big, important difference between working with roles and working with people.
Okay. And the same question for unarticulated user needs from direct user observation?
The problem with direct user observation is, and this is one of the problems with ethnography, again, you tend to, I mean, I've done this, all right? But what people do is they go in as a consultant. When I was doing it on air traffic management systems, doing the UX design, I spent 3 months being trained as a air traffic manager. I went in the apprentice role. Yeah, and yeah, that's far more effective than trying to observe it unless you're a really skilled ethnographer. And a really skilled ethnographer will want to be there for 2 or 3 years. Right? It's almost like definition. Somebody who says they can do it in a week doesn't really understand the field. So again, what we're trying to do is to distribute it, and it's a key principle of complexity. You work with smaller and smaller units to get diversity in the system, not large units or specific skills in that sense.
Thanks, Dave. And the next question says, it was quite prescriptive regarding age and roles.
Yeah.
Feels problematic, discriminatory even, and quite limiting in terms of the roles. What do we do with the people in their 30s or 40s?
Oh, there's lots of things. If you notice it, we had people in their 30s and 40s in the middle role as one of the trio. We just made sure we had the diversity. Right? Those are people on a management development track. Yeah. I mean, the point is you define roles based on what you're doing. And this transgenerational concept is actually linked in. Innovation in the humanities tends to be older people. Innovation in the pure sciences is very young people. Yeah, because actually innovation in older people is synthesis of material from multiple sources. Yeah. And we can do it, we can force diversity into it. And just to give you something else, if you're interested, I will not say which Agile conference I spoke at, but this is within the last 3 years, where a male keynote slapped a female keynote on her bum and said, "Well done, lass, and I'll see you in the bar late tonight." And after we challenged that and said the conference protocol doesn't allow this, they basically said that A, they enjoy it. And then talking with the woman, she said, "I'm not going to report it because I get secondary abuse. I have to confront the guy again, it all goes wrong." Yeah, and we checked that out. One of the things we're now doing with the Gemba system is if something happens like that, you tag it as micro abuse. It then gets effectively encrypted and stripped into a different database, so nobody can ever see it, and you've got that confidence. And then we look for patterns in multiple such reports and give an auditable report to management to tell them they've got a problem. And that's an alternative to whistleblowing, but we're doing that within the same system, right, in that sense.
Okay, next question is, how will the shift to 90% cheaper, low, no, zero code transform users, specs, MVPs?
Well, let's leave the question of whether ChatGDP will kill low code off or not, which is an active discussion at the moment. All right. When I was coding, I used 4GLs. And just if you don't know it, I'd actually been deputy financial director for 3 years before I moved into a software house. So I knew the job. I knew it backwards. Yeah, but I also was an amateur coder and I'd learned to code. So I actually wrote systems for companies based on what I knew they really wanted, not what they asked me to do. Yeah. And then I took but I built it as objects and I built it as subroutines. And then I handed over things to C++ programmers to make them more efficient. So I think the future of low code is actually not to produce production systems or for production software. It's another new way of engaging users. Yeah, but it's got to go through some development before it gets there. Yeah. And I say we may find ChatGDP does it first, although that's an open question.
Indeed. And let's take one more question that we have. It's is there a study where I can find more details about the developers finding more errors after changing their code?
No, we just did it with one company in Germany. We're looking for some other companies to play with it. The science is there, though, because what Ritual does is it changes your identity. So, for example, a lot of our safety work is getting people to, for example, in New Zealand on lorry drivers, and this was published somewhere. What we actually got is we got lorry drivers to strap heated belts on before they unloaded their lorry. Right? And what was happening is they were driving 200 or 300 miles. So all of their patterns were driver patterns. And nearly, I think 80% of the accidents were happening in the 10 minutes after they arrived at Wellington Quay. Yeah, and because they were switching to unloading, but they were still in a driver mode. So by having heated belts, which they were trained to lift with, we switched that identity more or less instantly. And if you talk to people in the armed services, they'll tell you they feel and think differently when they put uniform on. And you can do it yourself. I mean, I was at an Agile conference in Lisbon, been there for several years. I'm definitely not going again. And we were made to wear dinner jackets. Now, I haven't worn a dinner jacket for years, and I was quite pleased I still sort of fitted into it, all right? But you actually put a dinner jacket on and you tie that bloody tie and you put the cover band on and you actually feel differently about yourself and the world than if you're just in casual costume. I like speaking in a tracksuit and a t-shirt. So conference organizers, I probably shouldn't say this, who insist on a suit, will probably find that the airline has lost my luggage just as I arrived. On the basis, there's no point in fighting people like this, so turn up comfortable, and I pass that trick on to you, right? So there's a huge amount of evidence about ritual change in identity, so people see the world differently. Yeah, so it's not surprising it worked. We kind of like expected it would. Yeah, human beings need ritual to transfer between things. Look at next time you get in your car, look at the little rituals you do. Everybody does it. Yeah. Because what you're doing is you're changing your identity so you can be more effective.
Gotcha. Thank you for that, Dave. I'm just looking at the time and I'm wondering whether there is enough time to run another breakout.
Stay in the big group if you want. I'm happy with that.
Yep. So let's open up some questions here rather than go off to the breakout room in the interest of time. If there is any questions that anybody wants to ask verbally, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll do similar like we did previously. Anthony, go first.
Hi, Dave. Firstly, thank you for sharing the knowledge and information. I'm super interested in starting to get deeper into estuarine mapping and even starting to play with it with the work that I do. But one of the areas I'm a bit fuzzy on is what does the pre-work look like? How do you prepare to go in and frame the scope of the area you're going to explore constraints and constructors around?
I think you want to keep it fuzzy, to be honest, because generally the danger is people over-specify. When they start to get into this, it broadens. Yeah. So we use typologies to generate constraints and constructors, and we allow those to broaden. We're about to release software to capture this so that you don't have to capture it in workshops, and that way we can move to continuous capture and continuous representation. So, sorry, I'll explain this, that there's a difference between a typology and a taxonomy. Yeah. The problem is IT people love taxonomies, but it's very difficult to switch them away from it. So a taxonomy puts things into little boxes, and the problem you then have is boundary conditions. A typology looks at things from different perspectives, but doesn't say anything has to be an exemplar of that type. So we use typologies to generate the constraints and constructors to get more diversity into the creation.
And I'm assuming that you take some kind of question into the session, right? That you're trying to answer.
You take a field. So I mean, the one we did with Tom, for example, was looking at electric cars. All right. So we had 5 organizations who'd worked together under government funding to actually experiment with charging units which make your car a part of the grid. So when you're not using the car, it can give electricity back to the grid. Yeah. And they had massive conflict because they'd moved out of government funding into, well, somebody's got to pay for this, who's going to get the revenue benefit. So we just took that as a general problem. And we ended up with, I think, 20 or 30 micro actions where they all agreed none of them would have seen the sense of those until they'd been through the process. After they'd been through the process, nobody could see why they hadn't agreed to do them up front. And they were all small actions to change the dispositional state of the system so a solution was more likely to emerge. They didn't try and jump to a solution. They jumped to changing the domain, what's called the substrate of the system, so that it was more inclined to produce a sustainable solution than not. And that's really interesting if you start to think about that in technology design as a way forward.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it.
Okay, we have time for one more. Kelly, do you want to go next? Feel free to unmute if you don't mind.
Unmute, Kelly.
Yeah, rookie error, sorry. I'm involved in a project at work to improve psychological safety in our area, and it caught my interest when you said about how a ritual can change your identity, and I'm wondering if there's some way of working that in. So if we could introduce some sort of ritual and it would make the person more able to speak freely, or, you know, feel that they're able to speak more freely by becoming a new role that is emboldened to do so. Is there anything you can point me to for that, please?
Well, look at how they handle child abuse cases in courts. They give the kid a doll and ask them to describe what happened to the doll, not what happened to them. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure that sort of thing will work with adults, which is why we've gone down the microaggression route. So rather than try and make it easier for people to talk up, we've actually allowed them to report things without having to talk up. But then we look at scale over multiple reports rather than individual one. We're about to start using that for fraud as well, by the way, because there's a thing called nobody likes to cry wolf. And as I say, the problem is you can't make it safe for somebody to complain about sexual harassment by their boss unless you're going to fire the boss at the end of the process. Right? So what we've done is say, okay, we know that's the problem. Let's look at it in a very different way. And actually, this is weak signal detection, because a lot of this stuff came from the work I did with DARPA. Just get lots and lots of micro reports from lots of people in their day-to-day work. We're also now thinking, I was working on this with one of our medical anthropologists the other day. We're now starting to think that because we know we kind of like probably know who the complaint is about, but we've hidden that from the company. So this is all algorithms. We can then send the individual a memo which says there's enough reports on your behavior to say you look like this archetype. So they never see the reports, but they see an archetype link. And I mean, there's a wonderful program, if you haven't seen it, on Apple, which is called The Morning Show.
No, okay.
You've seen The Morning Show? Go and watch it, because it basically shows how aggression builds in to be the norm, and it shows how males who do things kind of like they didn't know. You know, it's brilliant in the way it shows it build up. All right, and the final episode of series 1 is just incredible. But the point is, what we're trying to do is intervene early on in the cycle rather than when it becomes big enough for somebody to make it a report. You need to capture it early, hence the microaggression reporting.
Okay, thank you.
If you want to know more about that, get in touch, because we can show you what we're doing on that. We're at the beta test site on that at the moment.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question from Ed. Ed, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks. Hi, Dave. I thought you mentioned design thinking at the beginning, but I may have misheard you, and I may have missed what you said about it.
Well, I mean, it was, I think, the ultimate indictment of SAFE is they decided people wanted to be design do design thinking and they wanted to issue certificates. So they put us another box in the SAFE module. I mean, one of the reasons I attack it so much is I don't want Cynefin to become a box in SAFE if I can possibly avoid it, right? No, we spent 4 years looking at design thinking from a complexity perspective, working with SRI and Stanford and other people. And what we ended up with, and you can read up on this, we ended up with a 2x2 matrix. Sometimes they're valid, where you have ideation, which is individual or distributed, and you have ethnography, which is individual or distributed. Now, if you have individual focused or expert focused ethnography and ideation, that's the famous double diamond. Yeah, that's IDEO and all those sort of things. If you have distributed ethnography, expert ideation, that's what we do, for example, with our ethnographic software. So we gather lots and lots of stories. We show patterns in the stories. We present the patterns to expert software coders and say, could you do something about this? Yeah. And that's more effective than traditional requirements. And then you get distributed ideation, where you have a problem, you distribute it to large numbers of people from different backgrounds. And again, we do that and we show contour maps, and that's how we find the 17%. We find the people who've seen a gorilla. Then you got the really exciting combination of the two, where it's called exaptive innovation. So to give you the first big one we did on it, we did it with a lighting company. And their problem was that people bought lights to light their garden. They didn't see lights as a garden feature. Yeah? So what we did is we actually gathered stories about people's gardens they liked. We didn't ask them about light. We hid that in the interpretation structure. That's called high abstraction metadata. And then we took all of the technologies in the company and we got them all interpreted into the same metadata structure. Then we mashed together at a metadata level and we came up with 5 clusters. And we showed that to marketing and say, why is this technology linked with this user problem? Yeah, that's like the guy, microwave ovens came from that sort of stuff. And that came up with 2 or 3 businesses. I think the one I'm quite ashamed of is there is a plastic rock which changes color, and they're lurid colors based on human proximity and warmth and water flow for swimming pools, which is selling really well in the Far East. It's entirely based on a technology originally designed to handle urine-saturated staircases in a football stadium. All right? And that's called exaptation. It's taking an idea from one space and moving it to another. And one of the things we're arguing is that people need to do is to basically everything they currently know how to do has to be stored at a metadata level. Because when you get a crisis, you're going to have to repurpose what you already know. You haven't got time to invent it. And this, for me, is one of the huge opportunities for IT. And it's one of the ways we actually use for legacy code. Yeah, and legacy code management.
That's great. Thank you. We have run out of time for any further questions, but you've asked some really good questions, and hopefully the answers you've received have inspired you to look a little bit further into it and see how some of these tools can be used in your own context. So just to quickly wrap up in the last few minutes that we have, I would like to share my screen. So bear with me. Great. You should be able to see a screen that's requesting a poll or some feedback. So if you can take a moment and give us some feedback on the chat on a scale of 1 to 5, how valuable did you find today's event? And could you possibly share one thing you're taking away from today's session? We'll give that a few minutes as you pop your answers in. So whilst that's coming on, I'll just go on to the next slide. So just a few announcements, if I can, just to close the event. The first thing is, I mentioned earlier on when we opened that we have a YouTube channel, Agile Northants. The link Imran will paste in the chat in a moment. Do take a moment to subscribe to that. We've got about 60 videos from our past events that we've been able to record. So if you fancy some of those talks, do check them out and certainly give us a subscribe. It always helps us to grow our channel and try and bring some valuable material to other people as well. Yep, thanks Imran for posting the link. Quick reminder again, we have an event in May, just roughly about 30 days from today. on the role of leadership in the future of work by Natalie Scroggle. And I've already talked about her, so take a moment again to find yourselves in there and RSVP. And the final announcement in terms of the reminder is the lightning talks. We would love to hear members of our own group, Agile Northants, you guys, to come and share some talks, some inspirations, anything that you're passionate about. Do fill in the form and we'll get back in touch with you and have you on for our June event. Having said that, a huge thank you to Dave for taking time out. This event has been cooking in for many months and it finally happened. So we're really pleased and certainly attracted quite a few members in terms of our memberships, as well as the number of people that wanted to RSVP for the event. So Dave, huge thank you for delivering an awesome session for us. Another huge thank you to our partner, Agile Mastery Institute, who've sponsored tonight's event and many events coming forward. So we look forward to working with you in whichever ways that brings that level of collaboration to the next level. And finally, a huge thank you to all of you to have taken time out of your busy schedules to come in and attend. So thank you very much. And anybody that's willing to stay back or wants to stay back for 5 or 10 minutes for a chat with the Agile Northants team or just a banter with other members of the group today, feel free to do so. With that, many thanks, and we'll see you guys at the next event.